Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sin. A very warm welcome to ArtScience Museum. Thank you for joining us for Immersive Ecologies, Sensing the Unseen. Today's program centers on the work of Marshmallow Laser Feast, the London-based experiential artist collective that's founded by Ersin Han Ersin, Barnaby Still, and Robin McNicholas. We're delighted to welcome MLF as ArtScience Museum's 2026 Artists-in-Residence. And this residency marks the continuation of a long-standing relationship between the museum and MLF. In 2022, the collective's acclaimed VR work, We Live in an Ocean of Air, inaugurated the museum's VR gallery, introducing audiences to an immersive exploration of the invisible exchanges that connect humans and the living world. And that collaboration laid the foundation for an ongoing dialogue between the museum and the collective. And in many ways, this residency represents an extended journey that we are undertaking together. And across exhibitions, public programs, and conversations such as today's symposium, we continue to explore the questions that have anchored MLF's practice. And over the past decade, MLF has developed a distinctive practice that has brought together artistic imagination and scientific research. They worked alongside ecologists, neuroscientists, technologists, and philosophers to explore questions that are at once scientific and deeply human. How do trees communicate? How does the world sound like to a whale? How might we experience the processes that are unfolding within our own bodies? And what distinguishes their work is an ability to render the invisible perceptible. Through immersive technologies and multisensory storytelling, data becomes sensation in their work. Ecological processes become intimate encounters, and phenomena beyond ordinary human perception become experiences that we can inhabit and feel. So in many ways, Marshmallow Laser Feast's work asks us to reconsider the boundaries that we often place between ourselves and the wider living world. And their projects review life as a web of relationships that are unfolding across species, environments, and scales. This commitment to exploring the entanglements between human and more than human worlds is precisely one of the reasons why the collective's practice resonates so strongly within the museum's season this year, which is called Forms of Life Beyond Human. Across the residency, starting this year into 2027, we are inviting the community here into three distinct but interconnected worlds of Marshmallow Laser Feast. In Evolver, featured within the exhibition Flesh and Bones, The Art of Anatomy, we journey through the inner landscapes of the human body. Then in Seeing Echoes in the Mind of the Whale, that's presented as part of Into the Ocean Journey Beneath, which just opened last week, we encounter the ocean through the sensory reality of whales. And later this year, Poetics of Soil, Fly Agaric 1, turns our attention to the hidden ecologies beneath our feet. One of the intentions of ArtScience Residency is really to create opportunities for artistic research to enter into dialogues with other fields of knowledge. And this residency allows us to build conversations around artworks and bringing artists like Ersin Han Ersin into exchange with amazing community of scientists, researchers, philosophers, and specialists whose work illuminates the themes and the questions that are explored through MLF's artistic practice. And so today's symposium will emerge from that spirit of dialogue. While MLF's artworks provide the point of departure, the conversation would extend into a wider interdisciplinary terrain today. Our speakers will explore how different forms of life sense, communicate, adapt, inhabit the world, and also how these processes challenge our familiar human-centered ways of seeing. The program is structured as a series of presentations that will be followed by a panel conversation, and we would love to take questions from the audience as well. We will start with Ersin Han Ersin, the artist and the director of Marshmallow Laser Feast. And Ersin will introduce the collective's practice and reflect on works that are presented at the museum His keynote will explore how immersive technologies can translate complex biological and ecological systems into embodied experiences and allowing us to encounter ways of sensing that extend beyond ourselves. And following Ersin, we will hear from Dr. Sanjay Swarup, Director of the NUS Environmental Research Institute, and he's also the Associate Professor at the university's Department of Biological Sciences. Sanjay's research examines ecological and microbial systems across multiple scales, and from what we call microscopic communities to broader environmental networks. And Sanjay's talk will consider how life emerges through distributed processes of sensing, exchange, adaptation, and he would offer a scientific perspective on interconnected living systems. We are also joined by Dr. Hari Vishnu, and Hari is Senior Research Fellow and Principal Investigator at the Acoustics Research Laboratory at NUS. Hari's work focuses on underwater acoustics as well as bioacoustics, and his research also extends into marine mammal communication and ocean soundscapes. Hari will introduce the acoustic ecologies of marine environments and the ways in which ocean life navigates and communicates through sound. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Alastair Gornall, Associate Professor on History and Religion at SUTD. Alastair is a scholar of Buddhist intellectual history, and he will offer a philosophical perspective on many of the ideas that will run through today's program to reflect on perception, interdependence, and the relationships between self, environment, and other forms of life. Following all of these presentations, the speakers will come together for a panel discussion where we'll open this floor for audience participation. And just on a very personal note, I think what makes today's gathering really meaningful and valuable is that it brings together perspectives that often do not share the same stage. So we're really excited about this. And across art, ecology, oceanography, philosophy, we hope you come along on this journey with us to consider how other forms of life experience the world and what might become possible when we learn to attend more carefully to realities beyond our own. And with that, it gives me great pleasure welcoming the artist whose work has inspired today's conversation and whose residency forms the starting point for this wider dialogue. Please welcome Ersin Han Ersin for his keynote.
Thank you, Xin. It's wonderful to be here. All the things that are very close to my heart and also to our practice coming together to have this dialogue. It's immensely important and wonderful to celebrate because our journeys often start with these dialogues and then it spawn out into the artworks. We rarely close the loop by having a conversation once the work is finished. And here we are. Now we have that opportunity. So I cherish this moment. It doesn't happen very often, even though it sounds like a no-brainer to bring an artist and a scientist together. But this is a very special moment. So thanks for having this moment kind of manifest itself, and thanks for being here. I'm Ersin Han Ersin, my real name. Lazy parents, they didn't put a different name. So it's my surname and name is exactly the same. And the studio that we run, based in London, is called Marshmallow Laser Feast. And this is, again, it sounds like we are into catering, but actually it's just to imagine what would a feast look like to your senses. That's the kind of retro meaning that we often assign, but essentially it was the only domain that was available, so we got the .com. As an artist collective, we seek to find emotional resonance in scientific stories that connects us to the more than human world, and often coupled with these emerging technologies to allow us to explore what is it like to be something other than human. And these works manifest themselves in the form of virtual reality. Other times it's large-scale video projections, or sometimes even smaller screens, so you can engage in the comfort of your home to tune in to breathe with an oak tree. Today, we will follow 3 breaths together, and each of these breaths will take us to one of the works that we would like to talk. If you can close your eyes, for a moment and 3 breaths with us. Just inhale slowly, feeling that the oxygenated blood going through your circulatory system. As you exhale, think that weight of carbon dioxide leaving your body, that you can feel your bones, your lungs, your hands, your forehead. Every in-breath is connecting us to the living world. Every exhale is taking a part of you into the world. So I guess we end with the question, where does my body end and where the world begin? And when we ask this question, obviously, we look at the world through the simple act of breathing, which is one of the most incredible vehicles that we have to keep us alive. And often, somehow, we forget that notion that we are incredibly well connected with this living world. And I guess this really describes it well. Being is always being with, even though we think ourselves as individuals, bounded by our skin and our clothes. But actually, when we trace our out-breath, the boundary between self and other completely blurs. This has many connotations and reflections over the millennia in different forms. And Thich Nhat Hanh, the great teacher of Zen Buddhism, calls this entire being, that you can hold a piece of white paper and trace it back to the sun, where that gave life to the tree, and the farmer that cut the tree. So you can connect with anything in this universe by holding on to anything else. And this notion of interbeing, nothing is just a being, it's always an interbeing. You can induce the modernity and look through the lens of science, and we understand now nothing is individual, everything is entangled, and this entanglement obviously represents itself in these reciprocal relationships that we are understanding in different ecologies. So 3 breaths will take us to 3 different projects. One of them is Seeing Echoes in the Mind of a Whale, which is the installation that is currently downstairs as part of the Ocean Journey Beneath exhibition. The second piece, which kind of dives into the human ecosystem, Evolver, which we created back in 2022. And that was the time when no one wanted to talk about the breath because it was COVID. So that was really hard to really communicate. Like, let's look at the breathing body. The third is our long relationship with the species of soil, and yet manifesting itself slowly into these installations. And Poetics of Soil is a larger body of work that I'd like to talk about. But I guess going back to following that one breath, the first one that you took, when you exhaled, a whale somewhere in the coast of Melbourne just went out to take a breath and release these incredible ocean nutrition through their bowels, which led to tremendous amount of phytoplankton to come out and take that breath that you just exhaled. So when we trace that one breath, which produces, more than half the oxygen in the world, is coming from these microscopic species. And these species move with the celestial cycles, the moon and the sun. But what really excites them are the whales that we don't think that we are related to. So how do we explore this kinship with species that are very far from us? Species that we've probably never seen in person, probably never going to see, and yet they play this incredibly important fundamental role in the entire kind of cacophony of life that is wonderfully pulsing. That notion started for us back in 2015, where we stumbled upon this notion called Umwelt. It is German for environment. Jakob von Uskal, who came up with the term. And, now I guess assigning some form of consciousness or even, a form of intelligence to non-human species is a little more easier. But in the turn of the century, that was really extraordinary because everything other than human was actually an autopilot way of existing in this world, kind of reflecting into the changing conditions, but never really considered as intelligent. So this notion of understanding the umwelt of a tick or mosquito, a dragonfly, wasn't a thing really. And that just, tickled our imagination quite profoundly. And, at the same time, our own ignorance of not really knowing anything about the living world, even though we drew inspiration from the trees, the forests, the blades of grass in our previous work. It wasn't until In the Eyes of the Animal that we were tasked to create a responsive artwork to Grisdale Forest in the UK. And that work kind of gave us the templates, which we still use today. That was conduct a thorough research, get really good at what you're talking about. And that would often require talking to experts in these fields to understand the physiology, the ecology of these spaces, to even think, what would a mosquito see in this forest other than me? What would a dragonfly feel in this forest other than me? What would an owl, a frog, and many other species? So we are coexisting in this pocket of life in this forest, and yet perceiving it completely differently. And that was the main idea. How do we take and look at the sensory features of these species? Can we even translate them into different forms of kind of seeing and feeling? Obviously, it's worth mentioning the wonderful paper, Thomas Nagel's What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Which basically says,
well done, dudes. What a show. What a show. Unbelievable. Really clever.
He doesn't say that, but he says, we're never going to know. Unless you are born into the body of a mosquito, the idea of completely disassembling their sensory organs to figure out their cognition, even if we know everything in their neurons, which we are barely mapping their brain, by the way, even if we figure it out, you're never going to know until an actual mosquito goes and this is my experience. So, but we've got big imaginations, and how art can play a role, this experiential art can play a role to, tickle our imagination, to expand our sense of self, to include these species. And I think it comes from that motivation, that space, but also that non-responsibility, because we are not scientists. And, as an artist, I can speculate. Obviously, I find it immensely useful as well as really resonant to start from a grounded imagination where the research and the researchers could influence and inspire us to create these works, while also there's a huge gray area that we can speculate. So each of these experiences are a very well-informed speculations, let's say. And this, I guess, sentiment really nicely lands because empathy is a muscle. You can stretch your muscles to include the vastness of the universe and the species that we co-inhabit this planet with. And I find this really meditative as a personal journey, that every project turns into a learning experience. Every 6 months or a year turns into almost a master's degree on certain areas that probably I didn't learn in my entire education life. So, holding that journey, and the only true voyage of discovery is to behold the universe through the eyes of another, which became one of the main line of inquiries. The Seeing Echoes in the Mind of the Whale is the continuation of this work that we started 11, 12 years ago almost. Cetaceans are incredible. They utilize vocalizations in ways that are really hard for us to imagine. And that kind of unimaginable, incredible reality is obviously explored. We now know much more about their physiology, how they utilize sound for foraging, communication, but also echolocation. And what does it mean to feel and see through objects? And as a sperm whale, what does it mean to talk to your friend from few kilometers apart? What is a personal space for a whale that big that can talk to each other as if they are next to each other? What does it mean to change the viscosity in your skull to feel and sense the world around you in a sharper or looser ways? So these are the old questions we started with and looked at a series of different species, working with applied bioacoustic lab of University of Catalonia, the lab, to really understand how the vocalizations for these species work and what do they mean and how do they function. They have got these hydrophones, basically underwater microphones, elaborate forms, all around the world, around 100 of those, combined with the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute's, continuous recording of hundreds of hours of ocean recording, combined together to give us a narrative where we follow 3 breaths of 3 different species. We start our journey as a bottlenose dolphin, as it takes a breath and dives up to 400 meters, as they echolocate, as if, you can imagine having a torch and walking through a dark forest. Wherever you look, there is this cone of light illuminating that space, pretty much like that. How would you sculpt a form, a 3D understanding of the world around you as a bottlenose dolphin? But then you come back and take a breath, and that becomes the humpback whale. Humpback whales don't use vocalizations that way, but they sing for an hour and a half. They have their own local dialects, even though world, according to fish, is exact inverse of the world that we consider as Earth. So they traverse the entire planet multiple times, sometimes traveling 20,000 kilometers back and forth to their breeding ground, exchanging verses. So they have their like Beyoncés and, Britney Spears and Kanye Wests and whomever. They've got their pop stars. They come to the breeding ground singing their songs. One song gets picked up. Rebecca Giggs, who's got a wonderful book called Fathoms, described that as an epic. It's like the Odyssey. They are singing the poem of their journeys. So nothing proven this so far, but we know that they exchange phrases. So I'd like to believe that their vocalizations are almost like a marker, a poem of their journey. So we are visualizing that journey in the installation. And the way we are kind of approaching it is taking these visualizations, sonifications on the vocalizations of these species, pairing them with a vast library of underwater footage. Tom Mustill, who's an underwater filmmaker and the writer of How to Speak Whale, is one of the key collaborators of the project, who connected us with a number of different underwater filmmakers to gather these footage, to start pairing the sounds and the behaviors in those sounds through these conversations to the images. And then those images go into an AI pipeline, which we kind of decipher what is moving, what is not moving, what is space, what is, biological life. And then that gives us a canvas that we can then sculpt the 3D world with the sound that we are injecting. So the experience that is currently downstairs is a moment for you to contemplate and maybe meditate with one question. What is it like to be a whale? What is it like to be a whale? Using a sound to sculpt a 3D world. What is it like to be a whale? If you were to tell the big epic journey of your, huge travels around the planet. Or what is it like to be a whale if you are going 2,000 meters deep every day, like a sperm whale, to forage that has never been seen before? So there are all these incredible, revelations. But in the journey, we are learning about their physiologies, how sperm whales' eye actually has a different distribution in their cones. Almost, this is another speculation, but can they actually stereoscopically see with one eye? Or a wonderful research also is done in the lab here, and that shows dolphins could see through objects, get a 3D sense of the object that is behind things, and then pair them with the normal images. So for them, seeing and hearing is actually the same thing. And when we look at their brains, the physiology, the cognition that appears in their visual cortex is so attached to the auditory organ. So a little bit unlike ours. So for them, it's one unified sense. So what does it mean to feel, see, and hear all at once in the same sense of kind of perceiving reality? It's really hard to imagine. So each of these pieces are an invitation to imagine this way. What is it like to feel and combine these sense of sensing? Obviously, sound is such an important part. If you haven't been yet downstairs, I would advise you to sit there. You can close your eyes because it's primarily a sonic experience with multi-channel installation. Our ears are not, designed to hear in water, even though it travels 4 times faster, almost slightly more than 4 times faster in water. But it's not really good at sensing full dimensionalities of these sounds. And some of the species obviously emitting infrasonic, frequencies that are hard to hear for our hearing. So our hope and the aim was to bring all those hard to imagine, hard to hear parts into the installation so we can get a glimpse of what is it like to feel and hear with your entire body. So you can see some of those species passing by as you follow their sensory journeys. And that kind of takes a part where, sometimes these screens turn into a submersive that you are almost diving in. Other times you can see the dialogue between different species. That is also known. Interspecies conversations are fascinating, that they are aware of each other any given time, that you can read it on a spectrogram. And if you don't want to look at a spectrogram, it's a little bit boring. If you're not a researcher, then you can look at the artwork to see how they are responding to each other. And I guess that resonated with many in wonderful ways, that the installation was alive in 4 continents as of yesterday. So, and each of these cities have a relationship with water, whether they use water as a waterway to, move around, like Venice, Montreal has the river that connects to the ocean. Obviously, we are here in an island, and the Sydney is obviously on the shore. And it's wonderful to see and feel this interest that culturally resonating with people to relate to those species. And yet, El Nino is on the corner, and the devastation in the oceans is far more than ever. And we are still approving these, drilling sites globally, everywhere on the shore of England or, American Gulf of America. So, these species might feel like distant, but the whole practice of being and meditating with them is to really turn that attention into an intention, and that intention into an action. So whatever can you do to imagine what is it like to be a whale should also come with the responsibility of how can I help? That's our aim. And when we look at these second breath that we took, with the question of where does my body end and where does it begin? No, that breath you took was 25 billion molecules darting through your lungs and fusing into your blood vessels and the cells, these red cells, carrying them around, delivering into every cell in your body. And that is, David Avram wonderfully puts it, offering ourselves to the world at one moment and drawing the world into ourselves at the next. And when you look at these, zebrafish cells, they spend the first part of their life transparent. So it's very well studied. It's probably one of the most studied cells in the world, that you can see the oxygenated blood goes and gets delivered into the cellular structure. The cell sucks it in and then exhales the deoxygenated blood that gets into the blood circulatory system again. That happens in our bodies. So when we think about that, we are actually breathing in as an individual. A cell somewhere in your body probably thinks it's an individual and breathing you in, and you are breathing the forest in, and probably forest is thinking, breathing you in. So we are constantly kind of transcending these boundaries in this porous way of existing. So who's breathing who, really? And evolver is this exploration, because when we trace our out-breath into a tree, we can also trace our in-breath into a human ecosystem. And we realize some of these structures are very similar. Somehow, evolution found its way to build structures that photosynthesis, making incredible giants, formed with the same fractal structures as well as our lungs that are doing cellular respiration. So how these two parts of the puzzle can come together to form very similar patterns. I guess it's the great rhyme of the being alive in many ways. So Evolver invites us to explore that world, following a single in-breath into a human ecosystem, and eventually ascending into the womb to see a cell taking its first breath. This process comes from a long research that we've been conducting with the Fraunhofer Institute, who are, their primary goal is to map the circulatory system of humans. And they've got these incredible data sets, completely impossible to visualize full, in its full extent. So we had to reduce it down and simplify quite profoundly to turn into the structure. We scanned one of our producers to give us the vessel that we can put these worlds, and then let people journey into the lungs, into the body, and explore human body as a big landscape and see these similarities, because from certain distances that you can see the heart looks like a school of fish pulling and pushing in different directions, and you can see the lungs from sideways that looks like a river delta pushing into the ocean. And when you come all the way down to the cellular structures, you realize how much of this looks very much like a galactic event. The whole notion around the different patterns in the universe somehow manifesting itself similarly was the main premise. So this single breath could connect you to the living world and beyond. And what would it, look like if you were to hold your hand and just only see the oxygen? And these are the kind of exercises that we were doing, and looking at the human body in different angles to strip off everything that makes us us, and then look at the oxygen that also makes us us. And tracing the last breath. So this is the out breath that goes into stomata. These are sequences we created for a documentary, but also turn into the visual R&D for us to the kind of forthcoming projects. The sequestrated carbon turns into glucose, obviously, that is pushed down through the phloem and xylem. While the phloem is pushing it down, and xylem is pulling the water up. That goes into the root structures, and there comes the hyphae, the mycelial structures. Some of them are ectomycorrhizal, some of them are vascular, having these incredible entanglements, taking more than 50% of the sequestrated carbon and trading them, turning them into chemical gossip to exchange between different species. And there gives life to many species. Marilyn Sheldrake's book starts with this sentence: there are more organisms in a single spoonful of soil than the stars in our galaxy. Let that sink in for a moment. What does that mean? How much we really think about soils? Because if every third breath taking us into a tree and down to the soil, and some of us choosing to be buried when we die, decomposed by some of the most incredible life makers and life breakers of this planet, taken in. How this vibrant life can be fully ignored. It's so fascinating to me. I mean, my own ignorance is more fascinating. For me, soil was this damp and dirt space that I had to clean my shoes afterwards. Now realizing, the more I look at it, and probably the more the researchers will look at it, finding species. When we start studying the soil to create a project and interviewing scientists more than 5 years ago, the estimate for the species were up to 3 million different species of fungi. Right now, their estimation is around 9 million. And the longer we look, the more species they are finding. And Just Spawn Network, which is one of our collaborators in this project, released a new world map of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi map. Please have a look. It's incredible. The whole world is covered with this. But the sad news is most of our biodiversity hotspots are not really corresponding to where the fungi hotspots are. Therefore, they are not really protected. So most of the fungal biodiversity hotspots, almost 90% of it, sits outside of our protected zones. So it's not that we don't know anything about these species. We are also not protecting them. So this is probably something akin to plant blindness, where we don't really see and appreciate the animism in plants because we are tuning to different animate properties to stay alive. But now we've got these tools and opportunities and hopefully these artworks for us to meditate on the livelihood of those, to overcome fungi blindness, to plant blindness, and see that livelihood. Then Poetics of Soil is an attempt to overcome this fungi blindness, to see the life that is moving through a single mushroom, a sporocarp, the fruiting body, that produces 1.5 billion spores, all of them only carrying half the genetic information, so they can't be hijacked, flowing in the air, landing in the right place in the right time with the right conditions to start sending a new hyphae thread again. And this is just one of them. They appear maximum 20, 30 centimeters far from a tree root because they are ectomycorrhizal. So they live in collaboration, in relationship with these species. And when you see them, there's always a tree root underneath them. So how do we even start to understand? And by demonstrating the complexities of a single mushroom, can we stretch our imagination to see the complexities of an entire forest? And then all the earth. These are the kind of provocations that we are, exploring ourselves, but also asking these questions. How can we bring some of these into view, that we can kind of sit with these ideas a little bit? And each process obviously starts with this journey of gathering data, whether it's a CT scan or going out and really photogrammetering, sitting with these mushrooms and trying to find them, because they're not that visible immediately. You need to spend some time, and some of them reveal themselves. And there is a very ritualistic way of looking at it. If I'm not lucky that day, which I've been to Central Catchment to find some mushrooms, I only found one. It's impossible to have one species of mushroom there, but they didn't want to reveal themselves to me. So I have to go back to find more. But as I mentioned, they're everywhere, and they form these incredibly elaborate forms, what looks like a neural pathway, an intelligent life form, responding, strategizing, changing without a central brain. How our notions of intelligence are shaken by this reality? How can we think of intelligence as a distributed, a functional way? Because for us, for a very long time, we considered humans are the main and the only intelligent life forms on this planet. So looking at these species in every level of magnification, whether in the scale of Earth or scale of the clusters of hyphae around one tree root or into the microscopic scale, we are seeing them solve problems. And this is a very exciting prospect. And looking at that world, this is a 3 cubic centimeter soil that we scanned. As we zoom in, that notion of finding a galaxy inside of a single spoonful of soil becomes tangible. So the long experiential desire, what we are trying to create is these series of artworks exploring this rich and diverse tapestry of life through different angles. And another one of them that we've just completed is Poetics of Soil, California chanterelle. It's one of these species that look like wonderful lantern. It's like an Olympic torch, pulling and pushing all that life and building another ectomycorrhizal kingdom to themselves. But these popcorn-looking forms are almost sculptural, and when you see them under microscope, they reveal something much more than what happens above the ground. And finally, taking to that journey, giving our last breath into the soil, as we dive in, our body unspools, and this is the moment that we can actually embody not just one, but millions of other different species. So becoming a decomposer, an arbuscular or ectomycorrhizal fungi, to see the complexities of life beneath our feet, and hopefully appreciate what keeps us alive is often outside of this sight. And maybe try to preserve it a little more. And we can stretch our imagination and our empathy to include these species that don't even exhibit our norms of animism. Finally, in one of my hikes, stumble upon this tree. I was like, this is ridiculous. A tree that looks like a human heart, and the piece on the right-hand side is from the Tides Within Us. This is like, okay, universe is listening and telling me a message, and now I am listening. So thanks for listening.
Hi, a very good afternoon to everyone here. Transitioning from that very imaginative and sensorial journey that Ersin brought us, I now have to gather my senses so we can go into the segment of science. So I start by thanking this beautiful invitation from ArtScience Museum, bringing us. I think as we were gathering before this, we were already thanking each other that this event has brought us together. Otherwise, we would not be in that format. And Ersin talked about that as well. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is to continue on the science side, where Ersin brought us at the end of his journey. And for that, the living network that is below our feet, the soil on which we tread on, we take it for granted. It's the dirt, it's the place where our food comes from, but it's also in many cultures the place where end of the human journey also rests, right? And of course, all the elements of nature end up at one point in this part of planet Earth, which is the soil. So I'll be talking about how microbes, the unseen elements, the living part of the soil, sticking mainly with the bacterial part, which was the counterpart to what Ersin was talking about earlier on the fungi. So in the bacterial communities, how they come together, how they communicate, these tiny little pieces of biological life have a lot from where we will derive a lot of knowledge and information on how our planet is functioning and how our food and other aspects of nature are delivering things to us. So in this hidden part, we heard a little bit about holding a small amount of soil in our hand. It could be as rich as 10 billion different microbial entities. 10 billion, okay? So it's not a small number, and it's certainly not of the same type. So if we can see on your left is something from soil, how different microbes, they interweave with the soil particles, how of different shapes and sizes. And as these soils from various parts of the Mother Earth, they are different in many respects, yet they work together. So there is unity in their diversity as well. So looking at our planet, if we try to find how much of microbial biomass, even though they are very small, but we can weigh them, right? Because they have a certain mass per unit bacterium. And by collecting them from given amounts of soil, you see here, the hotter the color shade, the higher is the amount per unit, per meter square of soil. And if you can see from the part of world we come from, here is the most dense in terms of microbial biomass on our planet. So if we are working in this part of the world where the microbes are in huge amounts, it becomes even more challenging than if, let's say, we were in some of these deserts in North Africa or in certain parts of Asia. And so this brings a lot of challenge into how the diversity can be studied. At the same time, if we look at the number of different species, we can imagine all the species, all forms of life taken together, more than 50%, the number goes somewhere around 59 to 60% of the world's species reside in the soils and reside in these microbes. So these microbes do not live individually. They do not live floating around. They build these kinds of housings. This is the default lifestyle of microbes. And in this, microbes will first come, they will find a surface, as what you can see here on the bottom left. They will attach to the surfaces. Cues will be sent out. We will soon see what those cues are. They will attract other types of microbes. And then as these microbes start getting organized, we will see in the next one how they get organized. They will start building these secreted outside housing, which protects them from the harsh and dynamic, very deleterious type of environment, which can be very stressful. And so this happens universally, whether these microbes are out, in this case, they could be in ocean sediments, they could be in the coast, they could be in the soil, the agricultural soil, they could be inside the plants, and then they could be inside and outside these fungi. We were seeing beautiful images earlier, or they could be inside and outside our bodies. There's no part of human body that is devoid of these microbes. That's another conversation. But coming back to these biofilms, these structures which are organized by these microbes, not everything is everywhere. We find that the housing is pretty much organized. The guys in the red, they are microbes of doing similar things, microbes of similar types. They're surrounded by these guys which are of yellow nature, yellow colors. These are artificially labeled by some fluorescent probes. And then the matrix, which is the background, is made up of blue-colored, the microbes taking up the blue-colored stain. And so these are very, very intricately organized. They are in specific numbers. They are in specific shapes. And in those biofilms, there are some that are at the periphery, some that are inside, and some at the base. And so you can imagine, even if it's a biofilm, which might be hundreds of micron being a millionth of a meter, you would see different amounts of diffused oxygen at the surface of this biofilm versus the base of the biofilm. And that's food for these microbes, because oxygen, we just heard about oxygen and breathing, whether it is oxygen or other types of molecules, we will see soon, they will have a gradient across these microns. And because of that, these organizations being one of the drivers, and there are other cues we will soon see. So back to these numbers, you don't see a single or at least a handful of bacteria that are overtaking the entire population in a given biofilm, right? Neither the biofilm is going all over the space, and it is in specific locations, specific sizes, volumes, thickness, and so on. And it is present, as I was mentioning, everywhere. Sometimes they are in nature, almost all the time they are beneficial, but at times they become menaces. For example, if we put a device inside a human body, it will start attracting biofilms, and microbes will start taking that space. And so pathogens and microbes which are deleterious, they will not be affected by our immune system, so they will persist. Like that, in nature, we find that these biofilms sometimes made or taken over by the pathogens. It is an exception, but then we are unable to tackle them through management practices. But at the same time, these kinds of default biofilms are very, very numbered in different ratios. How are these numbers obtained? These numbers, as we will see, are obtained by these microbes releasing certain types of molecules which are gaseous in nature. So they will diffuse out. Okay? And when they diffuse out, they will reach the recipients in different grades at different, along the gradient, different concentrations, even in micron scale. And then they will be perceived. Here, what you are seeing is the pheromone or this gaseous molecule from some microbe coming into contact with another microbe, turning on a particular protein which binds to the DNA, which turns on a certain genetic program, and now microbes start responding to this cue. And that's how fast-growing microbes, which might be growing very fast in a lab, will start slowing down when they are in these types of numbers. I will show you an example through our own study in a short while. So these receptors, this is a protein complex. Through X-ray diffraction studies, one can study these. A number of Nobel Prizes actually have gone into some of these kinds of discoveries. They're so path-breaking. And now I talked about volatile molecules, but in addition, there are other types of cues that these bacteria, they use to communicate with each other. So in that organized community, we find that another example is that of bursts of electricity. So we saw volatile compounds, pheromones, but also electricity is a very common currency or denomination of exchange of information between microbes, between the environment, between the living and non-living environment. I'll give you an example soon, but also between microbes and microbes, you get these kinds of electrical bursts. So electrical bursts for communication, and they are used to recruit. If you saw that organized way within the biofilms, things had their own place and different types, very specific types. It wasn't a large collection. It was a very specific number of collection of microbes. And so that happens by these kinds of electrical pulses going out through waves and then attracting other types of microbes. Here is a cartoon showing that. Something, what you see on the left side are waves going out. They will then attract microbes of specific types depending on the nature of these waves, and then they will start attaching to these biofilms, and very soon they will find their ways inside. And when you find that, you will see that they can be used to coordinate the metabolism across the group of microbes within a biofilm. So if there is, for example, a starvation of glutamate, this kind of electrical pulse burst starts, and then metabolism along the biofilm goes on, and then new members related to that metabolism can get recruited. So it's a very powerful way to communicate through bursts of electricity. Another example is that of these bacteria which can form cables. So I want you to think about sizes and dimensions, right? One particular microbe could be, let's say, just for the sake of argument, 10 microns, okay? 10 units. These guys will go to almost centimeter scale. So they might be from 10 microns, which is a millionth of a meter, to centimeter scales and tens of centimeters also, which means if we imagine this appendage, it would be something like a kilometer long hand in a human body length dimension, right? Very amazing how these bacteria can form different types of structures. This particular discovery came from a sediment in the coast in the oceans. And so sulfur, which can be in oxidized or reduced form, can thereby, through this reduction process, electrons will be released. They will transfer then to generate energy. Same thing like the transfer of electrons happens to generate energy in our mitochondria, which are the powerhouse of energy building process in every cell in our body. And who were mitochondria eons back? Were bacteria. So bacteria have not lost that capacity. They have been doing whatever they were doing hundreds of millions of years back, except that they started helping us evolve by giving those types of properties to every cell in our body, okay, which includes generating energy, in this case, by reducing sulfur. And so now, by looking at the numbers and by the connectivity, we can see that how we can use these to look at how they are organized within these communities. we can see this is from a local example of Bishan, where you have Bishan, Angmokyo Bishan Park. And we are looking at how, when rain falls, the communities from the topsoil enter into the water, and how these microbial networks start happening. Microbes of same color are doing similar things. And if you can see the ones which are of certain color, they are now related to extractable carbon and doing various carbon-related processes or nitrogen-related processes. Let's scale that up from a soil in one of the parks in Singapore to a worldwide map. Global networks of these microbes done by a consortium of microbiologists shows that there is a similarity of these modules of functions in a global scale. And we can see that this is happening not just in one or two types of microbial networks, but all types of networks. And so, again, bringing you back to local examples, carbon and nitrogen transformations, they can be used to clean up the environment, clean up the water systems, especially for the humans, civilization, which is living increasingly more in cities. And that's happening in Singapore also. So here, PUB is deploying these kinds of pandanus plants, and you see here helium ion microscopy images of roots covered with microbes. And as one of my researchers broke this particular root by mistake, we saw oozing out of microbes from inside the plants. So microbes are both inside and outside these plants. So what are really plants doing? Is it the plant cells doing, or these extensive number of microbial cells associated with the plants that do this work? There are lots of chemical cues that happen with these microbes that are within the soil, and so many different microbial signaling happens. There is microorganism to plant signaling, and from plant to microorganism signaling, multiple different ways that these chemical cues are exchanged. As a result of that, a lot of new properties or emergent properties are brought down by the combination of plants, microbes, and the environment. This is a discovery which we had reported some time back, 3 years back, which is very ancient, between lichens to mosses to plants. It is conserved. Plants releasing a type of chemical we had described. It is called methyl jasmonate. This is a chemical which allows soils to start forming biofilms, beneficial biofilms, and those biofilms then release volatiles to increase growth of plants. So it's a two-way signaling. It's very ancient, it's sensitive, and very, very rapid. And so I'm going to end by just showing you a couple of things. One is on multi-trophic interactions, microbes and plants. Let's extend that now to another layer of insects. So microbes will alter the way the plants will produce their volatiles, and those volatiles can affect the behavior of the insects that are visiting the plants. So this is an example of what we are seeing. This is a trial which has been conducted. If you look at plants which are being now infested by insects, we put these microbes in the soil. They go inside, they travel to the leaves, and now we can see that both the infestation is now in the treated one highly reduced compared to the non-treated microbially treated plants. And so these multi-trophic interactions can therefore be utilized from the nature and the benefits extended. We have quantified that, and of course, a lot of benefits are arising from there. This is the last one where I leave you with this multiscalar attempt in Indonesia on forests, where we look at the generation of forests from the soils by understanding how soils can support forests from a geospatial scale on the top left, on landscape scale, and then coming to doing plots, understanding the biodiversity of the trees, and then going subsurface into the microbes and molecules the way I had earlier described. And these can be then integrated and identifying how we can speed up regeneration of forests in a very, very scientifically driven manner. This is a site in Indonesia, 3,500 hectares. And we have been mapping using some of these gaming type of platforms, the 3D structure of the vegetation as it returns in nature. So I'll leave you with two thoughts. First is for soil microbes, some of the examples in this short period of time I shared, intelligence, responsiveness, and adaptability are not properties of individual organisms, right? I showed you some examples of that. They're collective ecological phenomena that emerge from networked interactions. I gave you some examples of those networks. And then if a microbial community can sense the environment, it can communicate and make collective decisions and solve optimization problems. That means not everything is everywhere. Depending on the need, there is a position and place for everything, and allocate resources and adapt to change. Remember the example of the gradients of oxygen, nutrients, and such. At what point do we call it intelligent? They are adapting. They have a memory. Microbes will see a stress, see a change. The communities will adapt. That's the memory. And there is resilience in the way the communities will adapt. There is intelligence in the way the communication happens. This intelligence was there before any other form of life appeared on planet Earth. And so that intelligence, and I gave some examples, has helped us in the way our neurons, the way electrical bursts happen in our neurons. I gave examples of how energy happens and generates in our cells, are contributions from the microbes. So intelligence has been inherited by us from some other creatures in our Earth, so we can be mindful of this unseen world. With that, I thank you for your attention.
So, taking off from that very thought-provoking talk by Prof. Sanjay, I'm going to delve into the world of sound, specifically ocean sound. And firstly, I want to thank the ArtScience Museum for giving this amazing opportunity to talk alongside amazing scientists and artists who study maybe very similar problems as us, but in very different spaces. I'm from the Acoustics Research Laboratory. I work with anything acoustic, basically, but mostly underwater, although some aerial work also. Now, specifically underwater, sound has a kind of a VIP status. Why is that? It's because underwater electromagnetic waves like light that we are so used to using for all our everyday life, it does not permeate much underwater. It just gets absorbed. It does not travel long enough distances to be of much use. And so the primary, or let's say one of the most preferred sensing mechanisms underwater is sound, because sound travels much further distances than light. And in that sense, sound can be our eyes underwater. And indeed, it is used more often for a lot of sensing applications by humans, but not just humans, also a lot of marine lives, including marine mammals, as you saw some examples of. So what I'm going to do in this is delve into a few examples of how we use sound underwater and how we can learn from marine mammals on how to use sound as well. So I mentioned that sound travels long distances underwater, but how long does it travel? I think being creatures that are used to the visual sense, we often do not appreciate how much can be done with sound underwater. But this experiment was done back in 1991. It was called the Heard Island experiment. And I'm not making that name up. There really is a place called Heard Island. It's in Australia. And they transmitted this really loud sound, and they tried to see how far can that sound travel. And from what that experiment concluded, and what you can see here, is that that sound was picked up all the way across to both the coasts of America, both the East Coast and West Coast. So it has traveled at more than halfway across the world. That's saying at least tens of thousands of kilometers, right? And that was back in 1991. Actually, that experiment has been repeated many times with higher and higher limits. So the only limit is now how loud you can go there. So that kind of explains why sound is a great sensing mechanism underwater. Now, first, let me delve into how we use sound to study our environment over here, especially the marine environment in Singapore. One of the main applications we use that is to study our reefs. In Singapore, we are pretty proud of our reefs. We actually, for being a hyper-urbanized country, we actually have a pretty good reef ecosystem, and we try hard to protect it. And there's a lot of effort going in to understand how these reefs are doing. Now, they are the tropical forests of the underwater world. So when you have tropical forests, you should have all its creatures, including all the background noise, right? So what do our underwater forests, the reefs, sound like? Let me play a sample clip to give you a feel of what they sound like underwater. It was a spoiler. So the main defining property of the underwater sound in Singapore is this crackling, bustling sound you see. That's not static coming from the microphones here. That's the actual sound you hear in Singapore waters. It's produced by this creature that's always going off with these snaps. And I like to liken it to frying something, like frying French fries. So that's kind of a metaphor I use there. The culprit here is basically the snapping shrimp. It's this pesky little creature that lives all along the seabed and colonizes these corals. It has this unusually large one asymmetric claw that it uses to snap shut, primarily to stun prey. But in doing that, it bursts a bubble. And that bubble burst is actually a very loud snap. It's so loud that it can be heard for very long distances, despite this being a really small creature. So in many ways, I kind of like to think of the shrimp as the crickets or the cicadas of the ocean world. They're like really small, but they're like everywhere underwater, and they're very noisy, and they're all you hear everywhere, right? And because of that, they very much define the marine soundscape in Singapore. They are actually found all across the tropical belt in other parts of the world also. But I think Singapore is a fairly extreme example of what they can do. And in terms of applications, they end up disrupting a lot of our sonar devices that were, made in other parts of the world. When they come to Singapore, they just don't work. Why? Because, well, these guys are always going off. But to us, they are also a source of opportunity to understand the soundscape better, because it turns out that where there are shrimp, that probably means there are reefs. So you can use them as kind of tools to guide you on where the reefs are. And maybe it's worth thinking also to connect back to what Ersin was talking about. Is this what a dolphin thinks about when it comes into our waters looking for fish, where it shouldn't be following the shrimp sound? So it turns out you can tell a lot about how well the reefs are doing or not doing just by listening to them. Healthy reefs tend to have a lot of shrimp near them, and so the shrimp are always going off, which means the region near the reefs is pretty noisy. They also have a lot of fish coming and feeding off of the corals. So there's generally more sound is produced at these rich reef sites or healthy reef sites, and also more diverse sound is produced. So there's more richness in the sound. In contrast to that, degraded or dying reefs or regions with no reefs at all often tend to be a bit more silent. And so basically there is information in the underwater sound on how good the reefs are or how well the reefs are doing. And that's something that we are trying to tap into to understand how well our reefs are doing. And so we have deployed recorders all around Singapore, listening for a couple of years and trying to figure out how well the reefs are doing to get an idea of where we are going or what we can do better. So if we listen to this biological signal from the shrimp and the fish, and in general the whole soundscape, we begin to observe some really curious phenomenon. For example, you guys have all heard about chorusing, right? What the choruses we have in our sound. Well, we also have bird choruses, where birds, you see them go all chirpy, chirpy, tweety, tweety at dawn and dusk hours. They're particularly noisy. Well, it turns out shrimp and fish do that too. They are also enjoying the sunrise and sunset. If I plotted the volume of sound I hear underwater, especially at a good reef site, as a function of the time of the day, and I'm going to show him some plots here. What those colored lines effectively tell you are, if you look around many reef sites in Singapore, it doesn't matter which one, but any of these reef sites, if I plot it as a function of the time of the day, you will see these two peaks at near dawn and near dusk. So there is a very strong biological signal in the sound here where you can see the chorusing of the shrimp and the chorusing of the fish in response to light. And we have gone further to even use this signal to understand our coral reefs and to go and understand how big the coral reefs are, how much the coverage is, what the richness is, and in doing so, hopefully scale up our efforts to monitor our reefs. But we can go one step further than this, right? We can also use the shrimp's snaps to kind of map where the shrimp are, because it turns out the signal is so strong and it's easy to isolate out each snap that you can begin to draw a dot on the seafloor, trying to triangulate where each of these shrimp made the sound. And these guys are always making these sounds. So if I listen for enough of time and begin mapping where each of these snaps come, I begin to get a map, something like what you see here, right? It's this dotted thing on the seafloor. And now this also tells us where the reefs are, because the shrimps are living on the reefs, right? So effectively, I can now begin to map out our reefs just by listening. And once again, I would try to draw a parallel on, is this what dolphin coming to our waters is beginning to visualize in terms of, is that a hot spot where he wants to go fishing, or is that a place where he wants to avoid? Just something to think about. But that gives me a segue to go into the minds of marine mammals, the opera singers of our ocean, and maybe more directly connected to the exhibit downstairs, seeing echoes in the mind of a whale. It's very well known that they're masters of sound. Whale songs, obviously, as Ersin already told you about, very mysterious, very complex, very rich, and we are still just only beginning to understand it and speculate what it could mean. Dolphins also very noisy creatures. They produce a whole repertoire of sounds that we can begin to study. So I'm going to look at 3 different ways in which we look at this sound, 3 different angles to it. The first part of it is how we use sound to understand these creatures visiting our waters, biodiversity, right? And so in case you didn't already know, we do have dolphins visiting our waters, which is pretty cool for a super urbanized state like Singapore. We have dolphins, dugongs, sharks, otters, turtles, etc. But dolphins and dugongs specifically, they make sounds. They're pretty noisy. So it's of interest for us to study them because they're very vulnerable to extinction risk worldwide, not just in here or in Southeast Asia. And so it's good for us to know why they're visiting, where they're visiting, in order for us to be able to take action to protect them. You might have even seen a disturbing news report about a week ago about this dugong carcass that turned up at Bedok Jetty, right? And so this keeps happening, and it's something we want to try and understand. What more can we do? What can we do better? Now, in terms of acousticians, that's a good challenge because these creatures make sounds. Dolphins produce whistles, clicks, barks, a whole bunch of sounds. Dugongs also produce sounds. So we can actually try listening to the sounds we've recorded for these cues to begin to understand where these creatures might have been. And that's exactly what we've been doing. We have, again, these recorders out there in these 10 locations out there in Singapore waters. That's a map of all the places that we've put recorders, all these reefs. And we are now searching through long hours of recording using a machine learning algorithm, just picking up these different whistles and clicks, right? I have a bunch of plots of these performances in Singapore waters, but I'm not going to try and explain the spectrograms. What I will do is try and play some of these sounds. So you can hear some of the performances we picked up in our waters. What you're going to hear first is a dolphin whistle. Okay, now I'm going to play a whistle and a click that was transmitted together. Clips. Right, so there's a whole bunch of these sounds and we're picking them up. And to summarize this part of what we are doing, these sounds are also, well, they are very cool to listen to, but they are also very good cues for us to understand what these creatures are doing in our water, when do they come, where do they come, and why do they come. And if we begin understanding this, we can begin aiding our conservation efforts much better. We can begin planning much better to kind of live in harmony with these creatures. Now, moving on, from that element, we can also use sound to answer more questions. So, for example, if we were in an environment where we had a whole bunch of dolphins or whales around us, such as the pristine waters near Hawaii, right? So we don't have such big pods of dolphins visiting us, but in places where we have huge pods of dolphins, it's often good for us to be able to know how dolphins are talking when they are in large groups. Do they have kind of a mechanism where one puts up their hand and says, "Can I talk?" Or is it like a leader-follower thing? Or is it the males who talk more or the females who talk more? All sorts of questions. Again, sound is our guide to understanding this, because we cannot necessarily see what's happening there. And human beings do not perceive sound underwater accurately or very clearly. And our hearing sense does not exactly work as well underwater as it does above. So we need use of technology for that. And that's exactly some of the technology we worked on here. It's basically a overlapping video and audio coverage system. But in addition to just recording the audio, we also have a system where we can triangulate exactly where each sound is coming from. So then we can begin to assign the sound to specific individuals in a pod. To play an example of this, what you're seeing is spotted dolphins in Hawaii. Those red dots are telling where each one of those clicks is coming from. And so what you're hearing is 3 spotted dolphins transmitting these echolocation clicks and doing this imaging and trying to build a 3D map of whatever it is they're looking at, or trying to range wherever it is they're getting to. But they are all 3 doing it at the same time. And so we begin asking who's talking when. But now with this, we can actually overlay it and say, okay, this person made this click and that person made that click. And so that helps us get into the space of beginning to answer most questions, right? Or understanding the behavior of dolphins better. We can do this with whales also, whale songs also. And so let me play an example we recorded in 2006. What you're seeing, those circles are estimates of where the sound is coming from and where different parts of that sound is coming from, just to make sure where the whale, just to understand whether the whale is making the sound from the same place or different locations. And this also helps us understand things like what is the sound production mechanism, what is the kind of sound levels this, whales come up with, does it change with environment, all these questions. The third part of what we can do with this is we can learn a thing or two about sound from marine mammals. And that's quite an exciting space for us to get into, because marine mammals, it turns out, are really experts in sound. In fact, dolphin sonar is pretty advanced. It's the most advanced sonar for its size and frequency, I would say. At least it's better than anything man-made, right? It's so it seems like dolphins have mastered this art through maybe millions of years of evolution. But what is it that makes their sonar tick? They've got this advanced hardware. They've got this melon that allows them to point in any direction they want and transmit a click. They can do a kind of a flashlight, but they can also do a broad beam. So there's all these questions that are unanswered, and we try to learn from the dolphins by mimicking them. And that's another part of the research we've been doing. So what we've done is we've built this hardware to try and mimic the dolphins, try and have transmitters that can point in these different directions, try and have receivers. This piece of hardware you're seeing is actually designed to be no more than the size of a dolphin's head, just to put us on a level playing field with the dolphins, right? And then we've also had some work where we've kind of imaged the echoes returning from a dolphin's interrogation. So when a dolphin transmits a sound, the echoes we receive, can we make an image out of that? And we get kind of rough images there, which are not very telling. But if we go one step further and use this hardware in a more controlled setting with the kind of same circumstances and with objects that we know, we can begin building images more effectively. But for that, we have to tap into all these insights on how the dolphin effectively uses different pieces of information and stitches it together. So that's another piece of the work we do in the marine mammal space. Now, before ending, I'm going to also talk about sound being used in a completely different world different than the hot tropical world we live in here, which is the poles in the Arctic and the Antarctic. In these places, the ice sheets that meet the ocean are melting and at an accelerating rate in response to global warming. When they come in touch with the warm ocean, the ice melts off and it breaks and it falls into the water, creating this huge splash sound, which some have likened to one of the loudest natural sounds in the world. And that is a sound that we can pick up and we can begin understanding how fast is the ice breaking off, how fast is the ice receding. But also, there is another component to this, which is the ice that touches the water, the underwater aspect of this, where the ice in touch with the underwater, the warm water melts and releases bubbles. And each of these bubbles, as you see in that high-speed video in the middle, is ejected at a large velocity, and it creates this loud pop sound, which kind of reminds you of what the snapping shrimp is doing with their claws here. But each of these bubble pops is very loud, and then when you have like tens and thousands of these bubbles being released from across a glacier at seemingly random intervals, what you begin hearing is this crackling sound in near the glacier interface. Now, for us, this excites us because we want to know whether this sound can be a signal of how fast the glaciers are melting, right? And so we've tried to ask the question on whether, faster the glacier melts, the more bubbles it releases. Does it produce more sound? And can we then use the sound to reverse and understand how fast are the glaciers melting? And so with that in mind, we've done a few expeditions to Svalbard, Antarctic, and Greenland to record the music of the glaciers. Maybe that's the kind of music a blue whale encounters when it goes up during its seasonal feeding season and comes back. But for us, the interest is scientific to understand, can we measure the rate of melting? And the answer is yes, we can. We've shown that we can actually relate the rate of melting to the sound we can hear. And in doing that, understand how fast these glaciers are receding. So that brings me to the end of my talk, and I just want to end with this message that the ocean is vast, so are the things we can learn about it, and sound can really be our eyes into understanding it. So maybe with this additional context, I hope you enjoyed the exhibit, Seeing Echoes in the Mind of the Whale better. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening so intently. I won't be very long with my talk, but it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to Ersin as well for producing such thought-provoking art, which definitely got me thinking when writing my talk today. So I'm going to be talking about my own disciplinary background. So I'm a historian, particularly a historian of religion of South and Southeast Asia. And there are certain intersections between Ersin's work and our local knowledge systems, whether Buddhist, Hindu, Taoist, Islamic as well. But specifically today, I'm going to talk about my area of main expertise, which is Theravada Buddhism. Now, some of you will be familiar with the Theravada Buddhist tradition. This is the dominant Buddhist tradition in Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos. If you've never heard of the word Theravada before, you will at least seen Theravada Buddhist monks, because they're the ones wearing orange walking around Singapore. And there's hundreds of Theravada temples here as well. But before I discuss Buddhist philosophy, it's worth having something to compare it to. And so I want to spend a little, maybe 2 minutes, on European intellectual history. On the one hand, to give a comparison, but also because European forms of thought about life still very much inform the way we think today, even in Singapore with our legal systems and systems of governance. So when we're thinking about the European intellectual tradition and how European philosophers classified life, as with most other aspects of European culture, it all begins with Aristotle. And Aristotle, when he first started thinking about, well, how do we categorize living beings, thinking about the question, what kind of living thing is this? He thought this could be answered at a fundamental level by asking, what kind of soul does it have? And so Aristotle started to think, well, how can I explain the diversity of creatures in the world by the differentiations of their souls? And so we came up with 3 gradations of soul.
The first one, the threpticon, is the nutritive soul. So this is the soul that plants have, and it allows them to take in nutrients, it allows them to grow, and it allows them to propagate. Aristotle also said there was a second grade of soul, the aestheticon, the perceptive soul. And this is a type of soul that also animals have, this second grade of soul, which gives them the ability to sense, to have emotions, and some forms of imagination, fantasia. And so this is the soul that animals have. And building on this type of soul, there is a kind of third tier of soul, which Aristotle identified, which is the rational soul, the logistikon. And this is the soul that we as human beings have, according to Aristotle, and it allows us to have our full capacities of reasoning and rational intentions. Now, if we move about 2,000 years later, we get this pivotal figure in the early European modernity, René Descartes. And René Descartes basically reduced this very diverse Aristotelian soul and simplified it into a single soul, which was basically the human soul. And he thought the only soul that exists is this thinking soul, and that is the res cogitans. Everything else in the world does not have a soul, and even does not have any form of mental life at all. It is simply just material. It is res extensa. And so when Descartes was thinking about animal life, he thought, well, these animals look like they're in pain, but they're not really in pain because they don't have souls. They're just automata who respond in a mechanistic way to their environment. Now, of course, European thought has changed drastically since Descartes, and modern biology is very different. But this kind of Cartesian view of life still pervades some of the ways in which we think about animals in particular today, and that affects, say, our legal system. So which animals have rights? And when we're thinking about which animals have rights, basically in the European intellectual context, we're always trying to say, well, how much of a soul do they have? How much of a soul like us do they possess? Therefore, a orangutan will have more rights than an ant in the frameworks of caring for animals and their rights, okay? Based on the idea of how much of an internal world do they have like us. Now, the Buddhist tradition is very, very different, has a very different understanding of the way we differentiate living beings. So while the European tradition saw the type of soul a creature had as the most basic determining factor in categorizing it, the Buddhist tradition essentially approached the inner world of living beings as a given and as something that did not need to be continuously theorized at all. And for the earliest Buddhist texts, until, say, the advent of colonialism in Southeast Asia, we find an almost unchanging perspective on the basic principles of life. All living beings were thought to possess consciousness, vijnana, feelings and sensations, vedana, and they were all capable of intentions and rational thought, mano cetana. So in terms of these basic mental capacities, human beings in Buddhist thought from a very early period were no different and not distinguished from any other form of sentient life. However, the Buddhist tradition did create quite elaborate taxonomies, if we want to use that term, of living creatures. So for about thousands of years, they wrote lots and lots of texts about how we differentiate animals, what kinds of animals there are, how animals are different from human beings, but they never focused on the inner world. They only focused on differences in karma, the bodies that animals have. So this is very key, the sense organs that they have, the physical appearance, the material food that they eat. So a lot of writing and discussions about what foods different animals eat and how that affects which category they go into. And also their behaviors, in particular, what sexual partner they choose to have. Okay? And so the Buddhist tradition focused fundamentally on these outward behaviors, these physical attributes as a way of categorizing living beings, and essentially attributed to all living creatures a fundamentally similar inner world. So to put this in very simple terms, and here I'm borrowing from the anthropologist Eduardo Viveros de Castro, European philosophers from very early on, they wondered if other bodies had minds like theirs, whereas Buddhist philosophers were wondering if other minds had bodies like theirs. And this difference then manifests throughout the next 2,000 years or so into similar but fundamentally different approaches to categorizing living things. So how does this relate to the wonderful art that we've been learning about? First, the Buddhist, in the Buddhist world, the assumption that we have fundamental capacities of consciousness in common with, say, all living beings has given rise to rich reflections on how our consciousnesses may move and be reborn in other forms of life. So obviously rebirth, as probably we're all aware, is a pivotal aspect of the Buddhist tradition. And the idea that your consciousness was once a consciousness of another type of being is a Buddhist truth. But that also gave rise to unique forms of Buddhist art. So within the Buddhist tradition, there are stories about the Buddha's previous lives, Jatakas, stories about in his previous lives how he was different forms of animal. And so one of them is a Jataka about the Buddha's previous life as a fish. And in this story, the Buddha is a fish, and he is in this pond, which is drying up because there's been a drought. And he's in this pond, and the water's getting lower and lower, and eventually he's just lying there in the mud, struggling to breathe, and he's looking around at his relatives, and he sees them wriggling around in the mud as well, and then he sees the birds circling above him. And he feels this great pain to see his loved ones in trouble. And so he creates a very concentrated, powerful intention. And he says, please, rain gods, come along, end this drought, fill up this pond and save my family. And the power of his intention was such that then the rain gods came, filled the pond with water, and everybody is saved. So it's a very simple story. But what it shows is it allows us to think about the existential world of a fish. So none of us are going to be in a pond, rolling around in the mud, feeling that pain. So on the one hand, the story allows us to think imaginatively about what it would feel like to be under those circumstances with a fish body, with fish organs. But at the same time, because we have a shared consciousness, we have the same emotions, at least according to the Buddhist tradition, we have intentions, we can participate in crossing over from the human species to a fish and think carefully about what it would be like, and to develop that kind of empathy. And I think something of that is present in seeing echoes in the mind of the whale as well, where we are asked to inhabit the body of a whale, to explore how these physical differences change and shape the way we may see and feel. However, what interests me in particular is in experiencing the mind of the whale. As an audience members, we are still in our own heads, right? So we're still experiencing consciousness, and we're experiencing the existential state of a whale, but with that shared consciousness. And in a way, when we're outside of the exhibit, we're in our existential state of being a human. And then when we're in the exhibit, we're immersed in the existential state of being a whale. And that practical diversity of experience within a shared cross-species understanding of consciousness certainly has intersections with lines of Buddhist thought that we find in the region. Now, there are also some intersections between Buddhist thinking and the exhibit Evolver. Okay, so as we heard, Evolver, this great virtual reality experience of how breath sustains our life and how oxygen in particular is this connection between us and the worlds around us. And in the Buddhist tradition, there are reflections on the human body. Now, some of you will be aware of the concept of mindfulness. And in the modern iteration of mindfulness is very much about kind of bare awareness and being present. And that is part of traditional practices. But also a part of traditional practices of mindfulness is the notion that mindfulness is actually a form of recollection, because the term sati from Sanskrit smriti means to remember. Okay? And so mindful practices are also to remember things about yourself. And in the Buddhist tradition, there are practices of recollection, of mindfulness, concerning reminding ourselves on what we are made of. And so there are practices meditative practices where you will remember that you are consisting of 6 elements: earth, water, fire, air, space, and consciousness. And in particular, you remember that the world outside of yourself is also made of these 6 elements as well. And there's that recognition that you share the same makeup, the same constitution as the world around you. And at each stage in this meditative process, you are encouraged to acknowledge for each element that this is not mine, I am not this is not myself. And in the Pali language, netam mama, neso hamasmi, nameso atar. So the point is, what does that mean basically when we're thinking of elements and then we're trying to realize that we are not it? The point is that when we look at any of these 6 elements, we realize they are not under our control. They arise and cease under their own conditions. They are constantly changing. And I can't point to any one of these elements at any one time and say, this is the I that I've carried with me since childhood, right? Where is this I in all of these bundling, unfurling elements? And so to borrow a joke from Thich Nhat Hanh, whereas Descartes very famously said, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, the Buddha might have replied, I think, therefore I am not. Yasma chintayami tasma aham nasmi. That's if he had actually said that. I just wrote that sentence myself. So the point of such practices is fundamentally therapeutic. Okay, much of our pain and our stress in life as living beings comes from relating to the world and ourselves as if either was something we could control or as something that could go on forever in our possession. However, as neither the world nor ourselves are like that, we suffer. The experience of, say, ill health is perhaps the most acute form of this, because we fundamentally desire to keep going, we fundamentally desire to live. And while it's no doubt hard, this practice aims to overcome even this deepest kind of suffering. Now, I think there are interesting intersections here with Evolver, where we experience the way air and oxygen constitute us as living beings, and also connect us to the outside world. At the same time, we experience the way oxygen does its thing, completely outside of our control. I think as was mentioned, are we breathing or is the breath breathing us, right? So even our breathing is automatic and continues regardless of whether we think of our breath as our own or as a core part of our sense of self. Similar to being mindful of the elements, Evolver usefully has us reflect on the causes and conditions that form ourselves and to take an objective view of them, perhaps as something impersonal. In doing so, we get a better understanding of who we are and maybe even a glimpse at a different way of relating to ourselves and the world that challenges our everyday experience. So whether thinking through living beings as sharing a kind of common base form of conscious or a common foundational mental capacities, or say the elemental constitution we share with the world, one outcome is a recognition that we are interdependent with other living beings and with our environment. Now, this leads us to what is the moral force of these types of contemplations? What value do they provide our lives and societies? Now, fundamentally, morality is relational, right? Moral actions, they are actions of a living being capable of good or bad or even neutral intentions. And generally speaking, moral actions gain their significance as good or bad as they are done towards someone or towards something that can affect others. Our moral codes arise from such a kind of social responsibility to treat others well and not to harm them. Now, the key question is, who possesses such moral responsibility and who counts as an other, who is a moral individual that we are responsible toward? Now, when describing capacities, say, for intention to all living beings, the Buddhist tradition views all living things as bearing some kind of moral responsibility. They are all moral agents. They are all capable of doing good, bad, or neutral things. In addition, all living beings, without exception, count as others we should be morally responsible toward. So, the moral injunction not to kill things counts as much for a human being as it does to an ant within idealized Buddhist philosophy. Okay? However, human beings play a special role in this picture, not as custodians of the world in the form of a hierarchical stewardship, but rather as the center of a giant network of social relations connecting all living beings in the cosmos. Now, I'm not going to read this out because of time, But basically, the Buddhist tradition, especially in Southeast Asia, imagine the cosmos as strung together by lines of friendship, mita parampara, which connect humans, animals, trees, clouds, and the gods in the higher heavens. So essentially, we're all bundled together in this social network, as it were. But importantly, human beings are at the center of this social network. So when human beings start behaving badly, our friends, the animals, start behaving badly too, and our other friends, the nature spirits, start behaving badly. And then the sky gods, the rain gods and the sun and the moon start behaving badly as well. The environment gets messed up, and it goes up and up and up until the entire cosmos is just so evil it has to collapse. But fundamentally, it is because of human behavior that kicks off this conflagration of immorality in the cosmos. And within human society, we're not all equally necessarily morally responsible. At the center of human society within traditional Buddhist thought is, of course, the king and his court. And the first and foremost, the living being who influences the morality of other humans is the king. Okay, and so within traditional Southeast Asian belief and practice, the onus on being absolutely morally upstanding, first and foremost, falls to our politicians. And then it filters down into the wider human society, and then into the nature, and then into the heavens, and all the rest of it. So while it is interdependent, there are grades of responsibility that we should be aware of as well. Now, finally, I just want to give an example as we're in Singapore about how, say, traditional beliefs and practices may still play a role in shaping our relations with other life forms. So here we have this the Jinlongsi temple. I don't know if anyone remembers that. Okay. So this temple used to be near where Bartley MRT is, okay? And this temple had, very famous, one of the oldest temples in Singapore, and it has a big Bodhi tree, a Ficus religiosa, and this was donated to the temple in the late 19th century by Sri Lankan monks who took it from Sri Lanka. And this tree descends from the same tree as the tree in Bodh Gaya where the Buddha became enlightened. Now, when the government wanted to take over this land, there were a lot of protests saying you can't take away this temple, but you can't remove this temple from where it is. But what interested me in particular about this history is, even though the petitions were not successful, the government agreed that even though we're going to move the temple to Tai Seng, we're going to allow the tree, because it is sacred, to stay there. And so today, the developers of Bartley residences had to build around this sacred tree, which is probably actually one of Singapore's holiest sites, because this tree descends from the same tree that the Buddha gained enlightenment under, though I think nobody in Bartley residences really realizes where they're actually living is sacred ground. So all I want to wrap up is simply say that I think such an example is a testament to the power of traditional beliefs and knowledge, and different perspectives on non-human life, and how they can still bend modern governmental reason if we give them a chance. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the really profound presentations. We would love to take questions from the floor. We're just going to give you some time for the presentations to percolate a little bit. And maybe I'd just like to explore some of the threads that have connected across your contributions. And we probably start with perception, because that seems to sit at the heart of most, if not all, of your talks. And each of your perspective also kind of reminds us that our experience of the world is always partial. And Ersin, with MLF's work inviting audiences to experience worlds that lie beyond the boundaries of our perception, could we ask you what draws you and the collective to these thresholds where perceptions shift or transform?
Sure. I guess that impartiality is the main reason, because the more we look at it, the more we realize how little we actually understand through this human perspective. We see RGB, there's a whole spectrum of light completely out of our reach, and we can hear a particular range of sounds, yet the sound goes much further up and down. And these are just some of those things. Obviously, we are tuned into this body down the line of evolution to discard. So being a human operating in this world is less of sensing, it's more of ignoring, I think. So every one of these exercises is to suspend that disbelief and maybe remind us what to acknowledge, what we are also ignorant of. And that ignorance is not like reflected on the viewer, it's starting from our own ignorance, whether how little we understand as a team of people working in the studio about the ecologies of forest or in the complexities in those ecologies or the sensory perception of different species. So every single one of them is an attempt to expand our understanding personally and then hopefully translate them into these opportunities and encounters so we can look at an embodied way of thinking about these things that are beyond our intellectual frameworks. And I think that's where it boils down to, because again, as you said wonderfully, it is so impartial. So what are the tools and the techniques that we can apprehend to see the animism and the all spectrums of life that exist among us and around the world that we are actually dependent upon?
Hari, many of us, including myself, think about the ocean actually quite visually. But you mentioned sound as a sort of great sensing mechanism underwater, and it really is the VIP. And your research points to how sound reveals entire worlds that are otherwise inaccessible. How might this change the way that we think about perception more broadly, not just in science, but also in how we relate to the environment?
So my take on that would be, the sound being a good sensing mechanism underwater is just one example, but broadening it to sensing anywhere, I think as human beings, we should probably, to borrow from Ersin, know that there is a lot more we don't know than what we know. And I think that is probably one of the starting points of science. Be objective, go through a line of inquiry, assuming that there is something that we don't know over there, and be open to anything as objectively as possible. And that goes beyond limiting yourself to the human biases of trying to visualize everything. What that means for us is basically we stay open to all modalities of sensing. Sound is just something I mentioned because I work on it, but it's not just sound, right? There's it's even not it's chemical, it's electromagnetic, it's sound, it's multiple forms of them. So what then the idea is to fuse these different forms of information to try and make sense. And when it comes back to us, I think at the end of the day, we still want to understand it in terms of visualization. So we eventually always try to visualize it when we see it. So the key is to try and gain knowledge from as many modalities as possible, being as objective as possible, keep digging further, keep expanding maybe the frequency ranges or the scales at which we are looking at, but try to keep it in a way and bring it down to a level where we can understand it so that we can take our state of knowledge forward.
And Prof. Sanjay, so much of your work really focuses on processes that are invisible to the naked eye. I'd love to take the opportunity to ask you from the perspective of agricultural and environmental biologists like yourself, how do microbial and ecological systems challenge us to rethink what life looks like and also where intelligence resides? I know you kind of touched on it in your last slide, but we would love to offer you more time to talk a little bit more now.
Yeah, so microbes, as I mentioned, were there before we all evolved, before plants evolved and animals and so on. And the mechanisms that we have, let's say, for things that are giving humans the food and the feed and the fibers for sustaining our lives, they all are provided by these plants or fungi or other beings which have co-evolved with these other microbes. And so what we are trying to do is to understand how these processes are, these synergies are. As we understand these processes, we can in a very ecologically inspired or ecologically embedded approaches, we can try to speed up some particular functionalities. To give you an example, if let's say we want plants to be having more nutrients, more beneficial nutrients to improve the lives or the health of the human beings, we can use microbes to increase those phytochemicals which have nutraceutical values. And these have been happening for ages. It's just that we are now able to take some portions of those functionalities, improve on them by adding them, and somehow speeding up a little bit of those processes without disturbing the ecological interactions. So that's the way in which in agriculture, ecological understanding and these interactions can actually be used. Something.
Thank you. And Alastair, we love the title of your talk. Narratives like the Buddha appearing like a fish, as a fish, it really invites us to imagine consciousness across different forms. Would love to ask you, what sort of role do these narratives in religious thought play in shaping how we might relate to other forms of life or other environments?
Yeah, thank you. I think they change the way we interact with other living beings profoundly, in a sense that if you think of other living beings having a similar mental life as yourself, you then, it engenders a lot of the social relationships that you would have with other, say, human beings, but you will extend those outward to non-human life, right? And so things like friendship, which is very much emphasized in a lot of the material that I look at, this notion that the world is strung together by friendships. That is only possible if you see other living beings as having a capacity to, one, receive friendship, but also to express friendship themselves, right? And so seeing that commonality, I think, is very important. But also I think that what is important, and sometimes is a little bit played down in modernity, is notions of rebirth, that just because you are in a human body now, be careful what you wish for, because you may be reborn as this animal, which, the poor orangutans, as we, have been suffering because of the rains. There's a, drop in their population by a certain number of percent or something like that in the last few weeks. There's it could well be that you'll be reborn as a non-human thing. And so you should take care of the living beings around you, because you and your relatives and all of your friends have already been born as those types of things and will continue to be born as those for eons to come. And so we should look after each other. That was what I would say. Yeah.
Would love to take questions from the floor. If anyone has a question, okay, sure. The second row, Mr. Go.
Hi, thank you. I would like to ask, how do you navigate around disagreements within your team, especially for Marshmallow Laser Feast, because you all work collectively as a group? And also whether do you all use AI as a research assistant? Maybe this is for the rest of the panelists. Thanks.
We fight. It's wrestling. Sometimes physical, sometimes not. But I think there is a out of jail card every time when we are kind of adjusting our compass towards the grounded imagination. If there's a springboard of a research or an individual that we can talk to, that gives us a steer. And then how the work manifests itself evolves and changes over time. But there are the kind of groundwork that we tend to agree mostly. But whenever we disagree, we go out and look at these things, the pointers, whether it's a piece of paper or literally interviewing a scientist to get the record straight so we can actually work towards it. Like any other human convening, we do have disagreements, but we, stand by them most of the time, and sometimes we accept each other's view even though we don't fully agree. So that's, a very humans, I guess, working together in a non-hierarchical way and yet tolerating each other's disagreements. And what looks like more than a decade that we've been working together, it seems like working. So far, so good. Artificial intelligence, of course, we use it for everything. I've got a bot running in the studio as a research assistant any given time that I feed all the papers. I don't understand most of those papers when I read it myself. So I really need someone to decipher it. Whenever I can talk to a scientist to tell me what it is about, then obviously it works, but not always available. So in order to decipher and understand this vast collection of kind of incredible human kind of surveys and research, we do use them very, very, very often. And, seeing echoes in the mind of the whale wouldn't be possible without machine learning algorithms that allowed us to, primarily the researchers who deciphered these hundreds, thousands of hours of hydrophone recordings to, pinpoint these moments of the vocalizations. And beyond that, for us to really kind of extract data from the videos to combine to create this coherent language eventually was because of the advancements in machine vision as well as the artificial intelligence. So yeah, it is parts of our lives on an ongoing basis.
And Hari did mention that you use machine learning in the work that you do. So maybe we can go to you next.
Yeah. It's so searching for specific things of interest in days or months or years of recording is like searching for a needle in a very large haystack, especially when what you're searching for is sometimes very ambiguously defined. So when we started off, for example, we didn't even know what sounds we were going to be searching for. We just knew there must be sounds in there of interest from dolphins, but we were not entirely sure what they would sound like. So at that point, machine learning has an important part to play where we feed it with these intuitions through the process of training, and we give it some samples of what we want it to look for, but within that vague boundary, bring me anything of interest. And then a computer can do it much faster based on the insights you've given. So it is literally impractical or impossible, or at least a very bad waste of time if I was to go and sit and listen to 3 or 4 years of recording from 10 island sites. But it was thankfully machine learning that saved me over there, where it basically scanned through whatever we had. And so now we have it running on an everyday basis. When we get a whole bunch of data, we run it through AI to kind of summarize it in a similar way as Ersin said, or in the same spirit, summarize it and give us the most important snippets or zones of interest that then we can go in and tune in and dig deeper and understand.
And would Prof. Sanjay or Alastair love to jump in? If not, we can take another question from the audience. Prof?
Yeah, okay. So machine learning is something very core to what we do. The reason is the amount of data we are generating is huge, petabytes kind of scale. So we cannot be working on the distributed computing resources even within the university. So we end up working with the supercomputing facility, and nowadays with the AI chips that are available, the spare time is available online. So I think we are accessing that. The way we are addressing it is in few ways. One is for genome annotations of these tens of thousands of microbial species. You can imagine for the human genome at that time when it started, it's a matter of less than 100,000 genes, close to 100,000 genes in terms of the protein functions. Each microbe will have about 5,000-6,000 genes, and there are at least 30,000-40,000 different types of microbes. Sequencing them in piecemeal, joining their genomes, annotating their functions, it's a very big effort. So that's one area where machine learning and nowadays the generative AI predicting what they can do is very helpful. Second is in the multi-scalar integration. One of the last slides in Indonesia had shown that things that are happening at the terrestrial, the subsurface level, and then going to the geospatial scale, right, from the sky, whatever we are trying to extrapolate to, and also from the sky, whatever we are observing, how much of that is happening at the ground. Somewhere in between, the modeling fails. because at the ground you have biophysical properties and models which are very good. Geospatial modeling, the climate and earth scale modeling, there is a lot of effort there. But somewhere in between, there are these things called emergent properties, new properties, which are in the gray zone. And that's where we are learning, we are applying machine learning to fill these. And so very nice new methodologies are emerging. So we are quite excited about that as well. So these two areas.
Thank you for the question. Do we have another one? We have a question from the audience right in the first row, Jolene. Thank you.
Thank you for the amazing talks. This question is directed more to the first and last speakers. Noting that we are continuous with the rest of living things in the world, right? I can't really tell what it means to be alive anymore or to die, that for that matter. Could you perhaps, I would like to hear your 2 cents on that.
Just to confuse all of us even further, some of the American indigenous cultures also assign aliveness to mountains and rocks. So these are very slow processes, and in the very basic levels, when we look at their interactions, you can also almost imagine a mountain is mountaining, a rock is rocking. So I think the provocation here is not to really categorize. Obviously, it doesn't matter which entry point you are looking at the same problem or the question, whether through a religious belief-based lens or very scientific and methodical lens. The bottom line is to have that provocation of how can we dethrone our sense of aliveness, that we are, us as species, as if we are the ones who only deserve to be alive and therefore intelligent, that can, operate with free will and our agentic approaches to something that we don't even think that might be alive. And I think that exercise is really useful, especially with the modernity in our, current ways of living. Us as individuals is the most important thing in the center of the universe. So what Copernicus did in looking at the Earth and not realizing it's not the center of the universe is very much needed in our thought system, that we can actually dethrone the human superiority to look at all living beings as a network of existing and being alive. So I think I enjoy that question for that particular part. That's kind of the confusion I sit with all the time.
Yeah, that's a very deep, good question about what does it mean to be alive if we're constantly having this continuity of consciousness. I mean, if I were to step outside of, say, the historical material, the traditional material that I read, and kind of think more philosophically, I would say what distinguishes your individual life right now is largely your memories, right? That you're constantly having your own memories, which will not pass on to your, say, next life, right? And so if you're looking for something which kind of roots you and anchors you a little bit, if you're feeling a little bit disorientated, thinking about the broad sweep of cosmic history and the pathway of your consciousness, you can take some heart in the fact that, you do have a kind of individuality to an extent, in the sense that you have things that you will not take on with you, right? So you have your memories, number one, I would say, is very important. One thing I didn't touch upon was, which kind of, I'm not sure if this actually answers your question, but about what does it mean not to be alive? In the Buddhist tradition, and it might spoil the kind of ecological theme a little bit, they didn't actually think that plants were alive. Okay, so they thought plants were not sentient. However, plants still were interacted with because they believed that plants were inhabited by, very often, other beings. Right, so it does kind of maybe touch a little bit upon the fungi stuff, that even though in the Buddhist tradition they actually thought a plant was as unalive as a rock, They believe that both rocks and mountains in particular could actually be inhabited by beings we can't see. And so in that sense, you are, even though you can actually interact with a spirit which may live in a tree, for instance, even though the tree itself is not alive. But the fact that vegetation and trees are not considered to be living beings has caused a lot of interesting discussions within the tradition about deforestation and things like that. And there are some movements, for instance, in Thailand, to actually they ordain the spirits that live in trees as monks to stop people cutting them down. So there's kind of interesting cultural adaptations to issues of deforestation. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for that wonderful question. Do we have another one from the audience? Oh, okay. There's a lady in the second row right on the side. Give us a bit of time for the mic to travel to you.
Thank you very much to all the speakers today. I have a question for Ersin. Is there a concept that either you or the collective care about very deeply that you've wanted to explore with an audience, but you haven't yet found a visual means for doing so?
What is it like to be a bat? What is it like to be a bee, to see the UV? What is it like to be a bat, to talk to a jade vine that is tricking you, that has got nectar? And what is it like to be a larva of a fish that remembers the sound signature of the coral reef that you're born, even after 2 years of swimming through the oceans and seeking to find your home? What is it like to be one of those microbes kind of being leaked by the carbon, or encouraged and the excited by the microbes, that the carbon that is leaked in this arbuscular entanglement under an oak tree? So the list goes on forever, as you can imagine. And when you start asking these questions, and I'm so glad because Alastair, they wonderfully kind of contextualize this notion of what is it like to be, has its own very innate limitations. We are always looking out from in, so from this human body. And every one of those entanglements is a reminder what we are not. And so that's like, I think, I still believe in that side of inquiry where we can continuously ask these questions and reminded by that we are not, but at the same time uncover something in the process of doing so. So I don't see as like one particular concept as the most challenging one, but all of it is a challenge. You know, with the belief in this empathy is genuinely a muscle, and every question we ask, it just allows us to expand that, sense of self to include the others.
Thank you for the question. We might have time for one last one. Great, it's my time. Would love to wrap up with a set of questions for each of you. And maybe I'll come to you first, Alastair. Is there a concept or an assumption that you think we need to unlearn to be able to genuinely understand ourselves as fundamentally entangled with other forms of life, and to live with a stronger awareness, that the world is really quite beautifully interconnected?
Yeah, thank you. I would probably, I don't know, this is going to be slightly big awkward. I would question maybe even the assumption. And sometimes I think that it would be nice if we could shift our concepts and life to change, right? And that if we just adopt, say, Buddhist concepts of interdependence intellectually, that would have ramifications which would be positive. To a certain extent, it probably would. But I think what's important to emphasize is that these concepts are part of a whole form of living that would need to be engendered for the full impact of it to happen. And so, interdependence, I could say, would be a key term, which would be very useful. But I think we have to be careful that we have to go beyond simply thinking that a change of vocabulary is going to save the world, because there are mechanisms and structures which are going far beyond us. And so in a way, it requires, while it does help, and I think it's good to teach people about these things, and it's good to think about these things and change our own personal behaviors, we need to think about, well, what larger form of life are these concepts part of? And how would that change the entire system and the way we operate?
And Harry, if we revisit this conversation in, say, 10 years' time, because what you were talking about kind of circle around listening technologies, what do you hope listening technologies will allow us to understand then that we cannot quite yet at this present moment?
So there's a bunch of challenges with listening technologies at the moment, which we keep hitting into. There are issues with speed. There are issues with the amount of information that we can extract out of it. It's still a lot of information, and we're still scratching the surface, but we have already begun seeing the limits of that. And so questions arise like, how can we do real-time sensing out there? Can we obtain information of something happening out there in the ocean and sense it immediately, see it on a computer displayed, and then keep seeing it in real time? And that's kind of a holy grail as far as a sensing perspective is concerned. In 10 years' time, I'm hoping that acoustics would have already crossed that barrier and gone to a point where we are not just talking about like one hydrophone or a couple of hydrophones anymore, but like talking about a whole network that's immediately accessing data and bringing it right into our rooms where we are, and helping us visualize things on a much larger scale than just pinpoint. And actually, I'm happy to say that the field is already moving in that direction. We have a few technologies that have broken the mold and have started taking us forward in there. So there is hope. There's this field of distributed acoustic sensing, which tells us that a fiber optic cable can actually be converted into an acoustic sensor. It's a very unique way of thinking about it. Nobody ever thought that the fiber optic cables that carry all our internet from across the world and bring it to us would one day be used for something as different as sensing sound. But they are beginning to do that, and that is beginning to take us to this world where now we can hear the entire world. There's like tens of millions of kilometers of cables lying in the Earth's oceans, and now we are just beginning to listen to it. So,
thank you. And Prof, it's a really prolific career studying environmental systems, microbial communities. Could we get you to share one thing that you wish people would understand more about the living world around us?
Okay, so I've been repeating that theme, that co-evolution, right? So things have been very well optimized with the co-evolution of these microbes and with whatever function. I tried to share some examples from the humans going beyond the ecosystems, which actually depend a lot on the human systems. And Alastair was talking about that centrality of that in the responsibility of that. And so this interconnection, I think, moving forward is taking the shape of this One Health, where humans, ecosystems, food systems, natural systems, including the microbial activities, are connecting the whole health of humans, animals, planet. And that, if we can keep broadening that and adding to it, that's what I would see would be the way that in which these sciences will bring things together.
And Ersin, if all of us could just take one shift, from just one shift from today's program, what would you hope that would be?
No pressure. I guess a very awakened sense of aliveness in something that you didn't think that was animate. So just look at a tree on the way back home, or look at the body of water around you that you might be seeing, the shore, what lives there, maybe just talking, having a nice chat and laugh. Just that slight shift would be the most important part, I think. But if I may advise, please go and sit with a tree for a while. make it a little longer than you would normally do, because what you start feeling and noticing after a while, that's often 10 to 17 minutes. You'll see the shift, and I think that's really important. So that, if I may suggest one thing, let's go and sit with a tree for a while.
Thank you so much, all of you. The invitation to today's program is not quite to learn something new about whales or about microbes or bodies or ecosystems. It is about that, but it's also to sort of cultivate a different way of paying attention to the world around us, and to recognize that we're constantly moving through worlds that are more than just our own experience. It's shaped by relationships and forms of life that we may never fully perceive, yet upon which we are fully dependent on. So we hope that these conversations with Ersin, Prof. Sanjay, Alastair, and Hari will continue to unfold as you spend time with a tree or with MLF's works, and as you carry more attentive ways of being with the world and its many forms of life. And we'd just love to thank our speakers again for their depth and their generosity, and also sharing a quick round of thanks to the working team, who is always invisible behind the scenes. So our wonderful lead producer of the symposium, Charmaine, was right at the back. Our supporting producer, Joreen, was around at the front of house handing mics during Q&A. Our technical crew, Keith and Amelia from Abinex, our videography team, Conclave, our photographer, Kit, and our amazing collaborators, Nowness Asia, who's here documenting the event today as well, Rose and Bryony, thank you. And finally, all of you in the audience for holding the space with so much care and so much thoughtfulness with all of us. Dialoguing on a theme that's very, very close to our heart. And thank you once again. We do hope you get the chance to see into the ocean. It's just right below in basement 2, and Evolver in Flesh and Bones, which is on level 3. And Ersin's new work, Poetics of Soil, is going to come on right at the tail end of the year. So keep your eyes peeled. Thank you so much, everyone, again, to our speakers.